Appreciate folks joining us. See a bunch of familiar faces and some new names in that. We were talking earlier, and I know we had at least one person. So, how many people went to the 1984 New Orleans World's Fair? It's Steve with Jim. Yeah, Mark was there. He worked on it. We'll be talking about that. So, is anybody here from New Orleans? Okay, I had put out an invite on Facebook in case anybody from there wanted to show up. So appreciate it. Let me get started here. Again, for anybody who's new, I'm Bill Cotter. Appreciate your joining us. And again, I thought this might be a fun way to get out of pandemic mode for a while. So people see the picture there, hopefully the ticket.
Yep.
Okay, great. Well, the New Orleans World's Fair went by several names: the 1984 World's Fair, the New Orleans World's Fair, the Louisiana World Exposition. It was known by a whole bunch of different names. It was a very interesting World's Fair. It was a small World's Fair held against the river in a very rundown part of the town. But back in 1884, they had a World's Fair, the World's Industrial and Cotton Centennial of 1884. And that building you see there at the time was the largest building built under one roof anywhere in the world. So very successful event. Was cotton again was king, so that's why it was the Cotton Festival. And New Orleans was looking for a way to come up to build a new convention center. And the idea of a World's Fair came along. Now, New Orleans obviously has a big tourist trade during Mardi Gras. They probably get 90% of their tourist trade during that period. But they were trying to find a way to bring tourism into the city for the rest of the year. And a convention center was something they really needed. They didn't have any convention space per se to bring in industrial exhibits, high spending executives, trade people. So they came up with the idea of a World's Fair to go do that. And they picked this spot alongside the Mississippi River that's bounded here in the White Lines. Super rundown part of the city. This was going to be a great spot to build a convention hall because it was next to nothing there. There were some piers that were used mostly at the time for freight ships to come in and unload. There was a rail yard that ran smack through the site. And it was really nothing much there that if you tore it down, people were going to miss. For example, these are some pictures taken on a site survey before the construction started. If you go to my site, worldsfairphotos.com, on the New Orleans section, there's actually 2 videos about the building of the fair, and there's some scenes here of the site preparation for it and some of the amazing challenges that they had to go through to clean the whole place out. But it was a part of the city that was not going to be missed by anybody, or so they thought when they started getting into it. And they found out there were a few historic buildings that caused them tremendous grief as they went on. But they decided to do a fair. They came up with a mascot for it. This is Seymour D. Fair, kind of clever name. And Seymour at first was just known as our Pelican mascot, or Mr. Pelican. And for about a year and a half, he was just trotted out as the Pelican. And then they finally decided he needed a name. So in conjunction with a local business and radio station, they had a contest to name him. They got 18,000 plus entries, and he ended up being the mascot for the fair. And I've not been able to verify it, but he's touted as being the first costume character at a World's Fair to go marching around the premises and interact with the public. So they started working on the site plans for it. Of course, every World's Fair has to have a great theme structure. Eiffel Tower, Unisphere, Trilon, Perisphere, ones that we know. And this site plan shows what was going to be known as the Tower of New Orleans. It was going to be a, let's see my notes here, 800-foot tall tower. Be a permanent structure afterwards, going to have an IMAX theater at the bottom. It was going to be full of restaurants, observation levels. This is the way it would have looked if you came down Julia Street to the fair. Unfortunately, ran into funding. They got money from FedEx to sponsor the OmniMax Theater that was going to be in the base of it. But as time went by, they just found no way to build a theme structure, and it got nuked out of the plans. So the plans kept moving along. We have a concept art here. I love that in almost all the concept art you see, there's always multi-masted sailing ships out on the Mississippi. And the Mississippi is not a dark brown. So I guess you can do anything for marketing diagrams. But this is getting fairly close to what we came up with for the fair. And in the next part, you can see what they call their marketing plan, how they had to split the fair into several sections because of other things that were in the way. The International Riverfront, well, down at the bottom, you obviously had the Mississippi River, but right behind that, that was split from the rest of the fair by an active train line. So they couldn't do anything to get rid of the trains. So again, they were being used all the time. So there's several bridges that went across it. You had the next section, the Great Hall, which was what the convention center was. You went up to Fulton Street. I'm just going to hang on here 1 second. I can hear some folks. If you're out there and you can mute yourself, I'd appreciate it. Just because I hear some background noise. So Fulton Street, there's a structure in between Fulton Street and the rest of it that was known as the Wonderwall. And that was to hide a giant set of high tension wires that were going through the site. And again, the Fair Corporation tried to get the power company to bury the lines, reroute the lines or whatever. But these were massive high tension lines, basically the power lines for the city of New Orleans. And they said no. So you have to come up with a way to get around that. Fulton Mall, they ended up having problems because these were privately owned buildings, a number of which had now been frantically marked as historical structures because the owners didn't want to have them torn down by the World's Fair. So they had to come up with individual lease negotiations for many of the properties to be included in the fair. So they ended up with all sorts of issues. You know, you're going to build a World's Fair and we're going to put trains through it. We're going to put power lines through it. You're not actually going to own the land. They had a lot of challenges that they had to try to overcome for it. But they got going, and again, concept art's always fun. I get a kick out of showing how everybody's always having a good time. Everything's going great, but this is what they used to start marketing it off to people. So we're coming in through the City Gate entrance. You would go along the international waterfront, again, sailing ships. And I don't know if they ever got any sailing ships, you know, to come to the fair. You would go into the Great Hall and all sorts of activity going on. So building up the enthusiasm, and that they started getting the fair underway. Had some issues, as every fair does, in trying to sell all the property, get all the space done. But finally, they were moving along. Sometimes, again, for any of us that have been involved in theme parks or anything, you know, concept art is wonderful. Reality is another. In this particular view of the Aquacade, you have a tremendously long staircase supported by absolutely nothing but a high diver to perform on. So keep this view in mind, and we'll get to the real Aquacade later, so you can see how marketing and reality sometimes conflict. They also built miniature models so they could get sight lines, again, use these things for design purposes, also for marketing purposes. Even if something showed up in the model, it didn't mean it was going to show up at the fair. This very intricate roller coaster running around the Ferris wheel was on the model for quite a while, was never realized. Let's start taking a tour of the fair. And again, it was designed into several sections. And Centennial Plaza was the main entrance for the City Gate, where most people that did not come by car came in through Centennial Plaza. So it was done. Oh, here's a map. I won't hit all these. We'll be here through dinner time. But here's a general map of the major exhibits that were out there at Centennial Plaza. Again, for later in the talk, just try to remember this outline of where the buildings are, the things in yellow, because it'll be fun to see what shows up later on. So you had the City Gate. You paid your admission. You got in. At this point, you were already formally inside the World's Fair grounds, and you're walking up to the City Gate. And the City Gate caused some controversy because of these two women on either side. They were done by a company that does a lot of floats and things for Mardi Gras, somebody named Barth Brothers. And they came up with these models. And when they were initially done, they were done in flesh tones. And it's kind of interesting when you think about New Orleans with Mardi Gras and party and everything. that you would think a city that would not be offended by topless women. Well, all sorts of church groups started complaining. They toned down the statues, made them look more statuesque as opposed to more humanesque. But I like to joke in my book about the fair that they probably sold an awful lot of extra film for people that were going from around the country, taking pictures of it so they could show their folks back home. So they were on their way in. When you get inside, you see the Centennial Plaza. The buildings, these purple top buildings stretched around there, were designed that way to be reminiscent of the 1884 fair, sort of a tribute to it. So you had modern structures with a design element on it. It was kind of a nice little homage that they did back to the earlier fair, and it gave it kind of a sort of an antique look to that part of the fair, while other parts that were distinctly more modern. The petroleum industries had a very large pavilion there, a giant full-size oil rig, even complete up to a helicopter on top. And this pavilion had a tremendous amount of interest by the locals because for so many of them, the oil rigs have been out dotting up and down the coast for years, but most people never actually got a chance to go see what was on them. So they actually had the working equipment for an oil rig. And I got a kick out of this. You know, you can see the work there with oil all over their pants and everything. They weren't actually drilling. So I don't know what they did all day to keep busy and everything, but they went through all the motions all day long of drilling oil wells. And the next day they would start all over again. So tremendous lines for the pavilion. They also had movies inside showing about the marine life that was building colonies around the legs of the oil rigs, different things on trying to show you that oil was not the evil industry. This, of course, is before the blowout in the Gulf years later that proved that these things can be a problem. So here you can see part of the crowd going into the Petroleum Industries Pavilion and the monorail going overhead. And this kind of showed a couple things that I found interesting about the fair. One was a very tight space. I mean, you had big structures you had to deal with, like the petroleum industries, but you also had to get a monorail through there, and you had to make sure you had the right curvature of the track, that sort of thing. But in this particular picture, it shows one of the flaws that they had at the fair was there's nothing living and growing anywhere in sight. They just didn't have the money in some cases to put in foliage. So some parts of the fair did not have anything in way of shade, nothing in terms of cooling mist or things like that. And for any of us that have been in New Orleans in summer, you can imagine you'd want to get out of the shade, get out of the sun rather than get into some shade. So I had talked to the fellow who had been in charge of the fair, and he said, yeah, it was one of those things you got down to. It's just like the opening days of Disneyland. Did you want trees or did you want working bathrooms? So they had a compromise, and some sections like this you'll just see nothing but sunshine. You also had Centennial Plaza, a very nice water thing. These fountains did performances and tuned to music. It was done, again, the design of the old-fashioned buildings in the back. And behind them, you have what's known as the Mart System, the Mississippi Area Rapid Transit. And that was a very ambitious $8 million project intended to be permanent after the fair to get people across the Mississippi River. And those towers up there went 358 feet high, making it the tallest towers on any lift system built at its time. And it was quite a ride. You would be able to go from here across the river. There was an entrance to the fair over there. You could ride back again. After the Tower of New Orleans project was canceled, they tried to tout this as the theme structure for the fair. Not quite up there in the same level as the Eiffel Tower, but give them their due, they try to make something out of it. And here's what it looks like if you were out across the river looking back at the fair. Can imagine being stuck in this thing. Like every ride system, sometimes sooner or later one of these things has an issue and breaks down. Hang on a second, I'm just going to find the magic mute button. Here we go. 1 second. Mute. If you do need to unmute yourself, you can just hit the space bar. So if I'm making some god awful mistake, please let me know. But the Mart System, as I was saying, can imagine being stuck out on this thing where they're trying to work out something, how would they ever get you off in the middle of that river? You know, it's bad enough you get stuck on a sky ride over a theme park, over a ski slope or something. There's some way to lower you down. Luckily, they never had to do a full evacuation of it. Down on the ground, you had other pavilions. Some of them were done fairly economically. The electric pavilion was done with blow-up buildings, basically giant canvas structures. I don't quite know whether the car show was going on down below because I don't believe those were prototype electric cars. Uh, in the same area, you had a carousel, and this kind of is an interesting view. It's an antique carousel, and what's interesting about it is that there was not a lot for kids to do at the 1984 World's Fair. It was really sold more to adults. Lots of nighttime entertainment, lots of industrial displays or anything. But most fairs, you have a midway section of rides or amusement attractions, you know, things to entertain the kids. Like for those of us in the 64 fair, you had the Lake Amusement area. You had other fairs. You had the Gateway at San Francisco. I'm sorry, Seattle. This one, you really didn't have a lot for kids. And I never was able to find out exactly why that was a conscious choice or whatever, but it was an interesting problem. If you go there all day, what do you do with your kids? So mention you had the lot of entertainment. A lot of it happened back there in the back of the Quality Seal Amphitheater. You had a lot of name bands come in, a lot of famous performers, comedians, people doing shows there. And that was a very popular area. Centennial Plaza, by the way, was named to reflect the fact that it had been 100 years since the last fair. Here, if you look very far over to the right, there's a little stand called Petros. And different World's Fairs have different food delights. Of course, the most famous probably being the Belgian waffles at the 64 fair. But you can go back to other fairs and see the introduction of you know, ice cream cones, you know, different various odds and ends. Somebody's chatting. Am I making a mistake here? Let's see. Well, who did the performing fountain design? I have to look that up. I'll try to look that up and let you know. So Petros was interesting. I put notes here of the recipe for Petros. Their thing was sour cream, chili, tomatoes, and onions poured on top of a bag of Fritos corn chips. And it became a massive hit. I mean, it was the thing from the fair. And whenever they've had any sort of reunion or memorial to the fair, Petros comes back out and recreates their chips. But it was very common to see people walking around with a bag of Doritos or Fritos rather, and you know, eating these things, and they were a real mess because again, sour cream, chili, tomatoes. But I don't know who invented it, Mr. Petro, I guess, but they became a big hit. Then we run over to Fulton Street Mall. Again, this was an interesting issue. You can see that there were a bunch of old buildings. And here's the problem again, building a World's Fair smack dab in the middle of a working city. You have part of your World's Fair on the right-hand side of the picture, and on the left you have a power plant right there because you can't take the power plant out. This is taken from outside the fair looking in, the Mart station in front of us, but the factories and warehouses on this side of the chain link fence were still working businesses, and on the other side was the World's Fair. This one I kind of got a kick out of. If you have all these old drab buildings from the turn of the century, what do you do to brighten them up? Particularly if the building owners don't want you to change them or you can't change them because of historical preservation laws. You take a bunch of metal pipes, twist them around, and put them out there, providing some color for you. And again, this is an overview. Again, lots of shops, lots of restaurants. Became a pretty popular place at night. Particularly, there was a Australian restaurant in there that they promised they could outdrink everybody, and generally proved that they could. Then at the end of the street is the Vatican Pavilion. They did not bring the Pieta over for it, but they actually brought a very nice collection of other artworks from the Vatican over here. The pavilion charged $5 to get in, which was a pretty good amount of money on top of the price to already get into the fair, but it had a steady stream of visitors. A lot of people pan the 84 World's Fair for various reasons, but one thing people agreed on that the Vatican Pavilion had a significant art presence, and quite a few art critics wrote very favorable articles about what was on display there. It also became a very popular spot for school tours and other people to come in for, if nothing else, I'm going to go see the Vatican Pavilion. I might as well see the rest of the fair. But of all the pavilions at the fair, this was probably the most well received, even though it was a significant price to get inside. The catalog from the collection is still very sought after by art collectors today because of the cataloging detail of the artworks. Then we run off to Festival Park, another kind of good time spot for the fair. Again, a map of what we'll be taking a look at. Won't hit all those, but try to hit a couple of these spots here. We're going to go into Festival Park. In the background is the Federal Fiber Mills building. And again, this is the sort of thing you have to build a World's Fair, but you have to go around things that are immovable objects. This building had been built in 1904 as a rope factory. It had been designated as a historical landmark and had to be left in place. So if you have a monorail and it's got to go someplace and this building's in your way, what do? You take out the window and you put the monorail right smack dab through the building and take it out the other side. So again, I'd love to think about what some of the design meetings must have been to try to fit everything they fit into this tiny little spot with some of these obstacles in their way. But just a general view of it, here they had put some trees in. This was one of the more colorful parts of the fair. Monorail station off to the left. We'll go over here. This was a gospel tent, lots of performances. Even though it was a tent, you can see scattered around the outside a number of very heavy duty air conditioning units. So it became a popular spot to go to. The Italian Village was designed after a plaza that I would totally mispronounce if I try to do it, from Venice. It was a very popular venue, and it had been thought for a while that it was so popular that after the fair ended, that maybe they would leave this up and have it continue as a performance art scene for the city. But it was eventually decided that there was too much other work that needed to be done in the area. Because again, you can look right across the street. Not a real warm, welcoming, let's go take my family down there on a Friday night sort of environment. So unfortunately, they decided after the fair, the area around there was still a bit run down. So the Italian Village was not continued. This is going into the area, and look at that ride in the back. As I mentioned, there were a lot of things that were interesting about the fair. Again, the lack of entertainment was one of them. This was Skylab. And folks that work at NASA, it was very different from the Skylab you knew. All by itself. It's not in an amusement area. It's one ride sitting by itself, and it looks pretty innocuous, right? Well, you would get into these gondolas. I think there were 15 of them, and you'd strap yourself in, and this thing would rise up out of the ground and would come up 85 feet and start swinging out with tremendous centrifugal force. So, again, kind of all by itself, right? One of the first things when you see when you walk into the fair, for me, that loves to get spun, hates to get spun in circles, that's a definite pass. Now we're going to go into Bayou Plaza. This was, again, here a map of it. This had a lot of the interesting displays. There's the water garden. I don't think I used any pictures from that. It was basically a giant area to celebrate water in many different diverse ways. This is one of the things that the theme of the fair was about, water, and how man depends on water and how we need to live with water and not ruin water. So we'll take a look through some of these here. This was the main entrance for people that drove to the fair. So I got a kick out of the signs. There was crazy crawfish section of the parking lot. Again, for those of us used to parking in Goofy or Pluto, you could park in crazy crawfish. You got up to the fair, and you could see it was pretty reasonable price, $15 a day. You could come in $28 for 2 days. There was a thing about season passes I'll talk more about later. You could get those, but I don't think they were selling them at this point. I think they had realized that they had sold too many of them. And now we get to what's called the City Gate. City Gate here has some more figures here. Poseidon and his mermaid, done by Blaine Kern. He's even got his name out here. Another builder of Mardi Gras floats and that sort of thing. And this was, we'll get Mark Sumner is going to talk about in a second, though. But this is how Bridgegate got its name. This bridge was being built across the river. There was another functioning bridge just to the right-hand side of this. and they were building the second bridge on to extend the capacity, and it was way behind schedule. And they realized they couldn't get it done in time for the fair, so they just stopped. So since they were not building the bridge, you ended up with a chance to put yet another isolated by itself amusement ride. So Mark is retired from Imagineering, like others on the call, and he actually ran into some real design and construction challenges on this. So Mark, if you'd like to unmute yourself and fill us in, and then just tell me whenever you want to go to the next slide.
Okay. Yeah, this is, we're talking about 1984, and this was my days before Disney, but before that I did work for another amusement company for several years. The company I joined in 1978, Aero Development Company, and they started out, a couple of guys, Ed Morgan and Carl Bacon, after World War II, building small amusement rides up in Mountain View, California. They eventually caught the eye of Walt Disney, who got interested, and they ended up actually Aero Development building a lot of the original rides for Disneyland before they opened. Mr. Toad's, Peter Pan, parking lot trams, things like that. Later on, they did the Autopia. They did the first steel roller coaster, which was the Matterhorn. They did the ride system for Pirates of the Caribbean and the Haunted Mansion. So they and then they kind of morphed into building a lot of flume rides and a lot of roller coasters. In 1981, they were purchased by a company called Huss, a German company, Huss, and they built a lot of the smaller rides, carnival rides, things like that. And Huss, and they named the company Aero Huss, and I stayed working for them. I worked for Aero and Aero Huss from 1978 until 1985. So towards the end of the Aero Huss, before they went bankrupt, just like the fair, they got a contract to build most of the smaller rides for the fair. And most of them were Huss rides, like the Enterprise you saw before this, the Skylab, I think it was. But they wanted to do a sort of a big visual water ride. So they decided to do bring back Shoot the Chutes, which is sort of variation of some older water rides. And basically it's just one big drop. And this was a big drop. If you think about, if any of you have been to Disney or Disney World and ridden Splash Mountain, that's a 50-foot drop, but this was good. This was a 60-foot drop. And so this was a layout, and I was the project engineer assigned to develop this ride for the fair. So I drew this a week or so ago from memory, because I don't have any of the original design documents. Those all went to Aero, who went through a number of bankruptcies and is no longer around. But basically, it was very simple. It was an up ramp, which you see on the left-hand side of the photograph, which would take boats from an unload area, a boat. It was a 16-passenger boat, a little smaller than the ones you see at like Pirates of the Caribbean. And a conveyor would feed it onto a chain lift and take it all the way up to the top. And it would float around a 180-degree curve, and then would go down this big down ramp. And the down ramp wasn't just straight; it had a little hump in the middle. So as you went down in the middle, you'd kind of get a little uplift in your stomach. And then it would splash down into a big splashdown pile, huge wave, which is the big visual for the ride. Then once it slowed down, it would float around and come back into the station. Very simple ride. The layout of this was really from water system with two different sides. On the left there was a reservoir, and there was a splashdown pond, and they were separated by a wall, and there were pumps in the middle. So what would happen is pumps would pump water up into the splashdown pond, which would raise that elevation, and then that higher water level would flow around the curve back into the load unload station. And when the water went underneath the conveyors after the boat had been lifted up to the unload station, there was a weir on the side, which is just sort of a low wall, which maintains the water level in that trough, and the water would flow back into the reservoir and go back to the pump. So that would create a circulation down there. Now, it's very expensive to pump water up high. You need very high horsepower pumps. So in order to minimize costs, and at this time, this was, maybe late 82, early 83, there was always some financial issues. So they were trying to do everything as cheaply as possible. So rather than pump water all the way up to the top and let it run back down, actually designed, what I ended up doing is putting a pump up on the top and making a separate water circuit. So if you can see where it says upper pump, when the boats would come around, they would get lifted up over the wall at the very top by another conveyor and then allowed to go down the down ramp. And that pump would send water across a pipe, and you can see in the photo, sort of the upper right-hand section, that pipe going across to the top of the up ramp, the lift, and it would locally circulate water at that elevation, so you didn't have to lift the water, so you go with a much smaller pump. It was much cheaper to operate. And it was cheap because we didn't have to run a lot of piping. We only needed to run a pipe straight across to make that thing circulate. What was the unusual feature about this is that most flume rides that people ride on, or boat rides that go down a chute, once they hit the splashdown pond, there are guides on the side so it can't veer off one way or the other. And there's usually, because the boats will be on wheels when it goes down the down ramp, usually, and there's usually guides underneath the water of some profile so the boat can, you know, gently go down into the water and you can control the splash and that sort of thing. Here they wanted to do something different, kind of go back to some real early turn of the century rides where they had no guides. So the idea was this boat would come down, it would probably go on 50, 60 miles an hour, and it would hit the water and it would just plane across the water. It would be unrestrained at all until it slowed down, and it would and there were some side guides, but they were kind of a funnel shape, and the boat would get funneled down and eventually slow down enough and go around the curve. And the trick with that is that it was a pretty wide boat. It was 4 rows of 4 people across. And if you got an uneven loading with certain hole shapes, the boat would hit the water and it would just like make a right turn or a left turn and hit the wall. So Carl Bacon, who was one of the founders of Aero Development, was actually still there, still coming in a few days a week. So he and I got together. We ended up making a scale model of the run out and the down ramp. And it was a boat, it was maybe, I'm thinking it was about 2.5 feet long, maybe a little bigger. And we had weights that we could slide from side to side, and it was made out of wood, and we could change the bottom of it by bolting on different hole shapes. And we found some hole shapes were just terrible. You know, it would just take a hard right 90-degree turn. And eventually, with lots of experimenting, we found out that we could find a hole shape that was pretty insensitive to differential loading, and the boats would go straight. So that's what we ended up doing. So that was sort of unique for this kind of a ride. Again, trying to save money, they didn't send any engineers like myself out to the site to put it up. We did the drawings, we sent it off. Aero Hoos hired a local contractor to install their rides. And every once in a while I'd get a call and ask me some question, but there's very little contact because, you know, to most people, it was just it's a very simple ride. You go around in a circle and you splash down. So there was no need to send anybody out. So shortly before, about 2 weeks before the ride opened, I guess they were there, the contractor had left, they turned over the ride, it was supposedly operating, and we got a call and said, well, we got a problem with the ride. I said, what's the problem? He said, well, it goes up fine, it comes down fine, splashes down fine, but it's taken about 10 minutes for the boat to go around the curve. I said, you know, are the pumps on? What's going on? They go, yeah, pumps are on, they're going strong, can't figure it out. And so nobody could figure out because nobody else knew what was going on. There was nobody there. And so my boss packed me up and they sent me to New Orleans to go solve the problem. And when I got there, I pretty much saw it, the picture you see now. I saw the problem, so I called my boss and I said, okay, I know the problem. He goes, what is it? I need to explain it to you. I need you to go find this one drawing. So I told him what the drawing number was. I said, go find it and come back and we'll talk. So they got the drawing, and it was essentially this drawing. And what I had done in order to save money, if you look at the wall between the splashdown pond and the reservoir where it's cross-hatched red, I had actually taken the drawing that showed the concrete details, and I had crossed out a section like that with a note. It said, you know, C note 1 or whatever. And it said something like, this section may be made either by forming a concrete wall or by using waterproofed earthen berm, because it costs money to form up a concrete wall. So I thought they could save some money, but if they just wanted to berm up some earth, they could put some shotcrete over it. You know, it was a temporary installation and they could save some money. So I gave them the option of doing it either way. Well, what I found out when I got there, when I first got there, I went to the load unload station and I stood and I looked out and I saw this. This is what I saw. Next slide, please. So what I saw is they hadn't put the wall or the earthen berm on. They hadn't put anything in there. So the reservoir and the splashdown pond were all just one big body of water. And the pumps were running, but the pumps would just, circulate water locally, not sending hardly anything around the interior. So there was no water flow essentially around the curve to push the boats around, which is why it was taking 10 minutes. It was just the momentum of the boat. Eventually they would finally make their way over the load and unload. And here at this point I had, about a week and a half before the fair opened. And of course my boss said, you got to fix it. We got to open it, lots of pressure. So in asking around, I'm trying to figure out how I can separate and build the wall. I found out that the Mart, the Skyway system that Bill had talked about, was already open. Pardon me?
See the.
No, somebody else is chatting. Hang on a second. I will find the mute button here.
No, I couldn't see the different pictures.
Okay. So let's see, Mark, I will unmute you.
Okay. Yeah, there was a question of what the difference is. So if you go back one slide. Okay. If you see right in the middle on the left, you see that red wall in between the reservoir and the splashdown pond that's highlighted red. If you look at that, that's supposed to be a wall that separates those two ponds. So if you look at the next photo, that wall was missing. They had never installed the wall. And so it was all just one big pond. So I found out that the Mart, the Skyway that Bill had talked about, was already open. In fact, part of the fair had opened earlier. This part had been blocked off and it wasn't open for a couple of weeks. They did a little phased opening, I think, to bring some money in. And I found out that when they had tested and certified the ride, the Skyway ride before it opened, they had used sandbags. I found out that there were, I think it was 1,000 sandbags that they had used, and they were stored under the station for the Skyway, the loading station. So I ended up buying all of those, and I went and I rented a pickup truck and I hired a couple of laborers, and we could only work at night to go get the sandbags because the ride was open, the Skyway was open during the day. So at night we would go over and we'd load up the pickup trucks and we'd haul them across the fairgrounds over here, and we put a boat in the reservoir, and we would lift all the bags up because the boat on the load unload station was elevated. We'd lift those up, we'd put them in a boat, we'd float them over, and essentially we built a wall in between the end of the wall where the pumps were and one of the run-out guides. And then we took plywood and we plated the right-hand side run-out guides with reservoir and basically made a new wall, made a barrier between the reservoir and the splashdown pond. Now, because the reservoir was bigger, they had actually put too much water in there, so we had to drain water out and had to build some siphons and do that overnight. So it took us, I don't know, 4 or 5 nights, as I recall, to build this temporary wall. And we finally got it open. So the ride opened on time. I went home before it actually opened because everyone was trying to save money and it cost money to have me in New Orleans. So I never went to the fair when this part was open. I did get over to the other one a little bit during the day, but there was a very few parts of it open. After the fair opened, I think Bill will talk about the financial issues with the fair. All of the Hoos rides, including this, were seized, and they sat for several years under lock and key, which I think also, helped with the demise of Aero Hoos at the time. And this was actually ended up in Astro World in 1988 in Houston, and was renamed the Tidal Wave. Now, they did make a couple of changes when they bought it and moved it over. They switched the rotation of the ride, so they switched the position of the down ramp and the up ramp. They kept the upper water circuit, but instead of having that pipe that went across in open air, actually ran the pipe underneath the trough, so it wasn't so visible, which is something I had thought about, but it cost more to put. It was more pipe, so it was cheaper to go across for us. And then they also took out they decided not to do the unrestrained splashdown. They put side guides in it. Astro World closed, I think, in 2005, and I had heard at some point that that Six Flags had sent it to Great Escape in New York, and it was in storage there. But as far as I know, it was never reconstructed anywhere. So that's my little piece of the fair.
Just think about it. If they ever do reconstruct it, you might get called back to fix it one more time.
You never know. I've been called back before. I see on one of the chats there's a question about intellectual property and S&S. Yes, S&S, when Arrow Hoos went bankrupt in, I think, 1985, early 86. I left in 1985 because they were going bankrupt and they were moving from California to Utah. That's when I bailed out. And I ended up working for them for about 6 months just out of my house. The last thing I did for them was to do Arrow's proposal for the Zippity Doo-Dah ride at Disneyland, which turned out to be Splash Mountain, which of course they didn't get. Yes, and so Arrow became Aerodynamics in the bankruptcy, and they ran for a few years. And the Aerodynamics was bought by S&S Power Sports, I think it was, in Utah, and eventually a company called Sansei in Japan that has actually done work for Disney, and I've worked with them quite a bit. They now own S&S. So it's a very small world when you get out there. And there's a question from Ken, is there any water in the Dhanraj? Yes, a little bit. Just so it wasn't dry, because we did have the two separate circuits, I also did put in a very small pump that pumped water up high, but it was pretty efficient because it was a very small pump, and we just took that to the top of the down ramp. So there was some water coming down for just show purposes, but it was a small quantity compared to what the amount that you need to float a boat around.
Great, and we'll get into the bankruptcy and stuff further on. I don't see the chat, by the way, for the most part as I'm talking. I saw one person had a question here when I was talking about the Vatican Pavilion, if there were other pavilions international ones that charge admission. Not that I recall. Basically, most of them were more than glad to get you to come in for the tourism aspects of their countries. But not the Vatican. They spent a lot more in their pavilion than others, so the admission was kind of justified. Here you had sorry.
I'm just saying, I see Derek asked questions. Why did the Hoos rides get seized? Maybe you can touch on that. I wasn't really privy to all the financial dealings. I just know that they could not sell them.
Yeah, I'll hit that
after the ride.
I'll hit that when we get to the post-mortem on the fair. So there were some kid-oriented things. This was a super popular thing, the kid wash, styled after a car wash. Hot day, you could go out and run your kids through it, and then hopefully they would dry off. Again, water was a big factor at the fair. That was one of the big themes for it. But, I wonder how many people took their kids out planning in advance to take them to the kid wash. Because if you look, these kids are wearing sneakers. It looks like they're regular clothes. There's a girl in the back in a bathing suit. But I feel bad for the parents that took your kid out. They see everybody else is having a good time. They want to run around. And now you've got a very squishy 6 or 7-year-old to take around for the rest of the fair. The Ferris wheel put in here was the largest Ferris wheel in the world at the time. It was 178 feet tall. Had 40 different gondolas. And Mark had his challenges getting that ride, the shoot-to-shoot rides done. This was another one where they designed real big, and they got it finished literally about 2 days before the fair opened. Tremendous question on whether they were going to get it done on time. Was some engineering challenges, as Mark mentioned. Sometimes the engineers have one idea, the builders have another. So it barely got open in time, but it did make it and successfully ran the season without any problems. We look down over the rest of Bayou Plaza. Biggest industrial exhibit out there is Chrysler on the left. You have the amphitheater over to the right. In the center was a energy efficient home, the brown building, to show people how it's interesting. It doesn't have solar panels on it, but the rest of the building was designed to be very energy efficient in terms of the insulation, other things that were in there. Chrysler, as I mentioned, they had a big exhibit. They were the only car exhibit. And I got a kick out of this. This was their prototype of a new car coming out. Everything was laser disc at the time. So you have your laser Atlas video disc player, your laser disc audio system, but she's looking at a map, and this was the first introduction of GPS for a car system. So obviously the ones we have now are a lot different, but again, 1984, the idea of having a GPS and a moving map system in your car was something out of James Bond and his Aston Martin days. So GM was Chrysler was going through a real rebirth and trying to reestablish themselves at this point. and they went all out on their exhibit there. This was an interesting section. This was called the Empress. Actually, this was the Cajun Walk. Yeah, the Cajun Walk was designed to take you around with some shade, get you around the water, but it was done like fishing piers that were done all throughout Louisiana. The idea to give it a little bit of a native flair and also to get you out of the sun. Out in the middle of the bayou was the African Queen. And yes, this was the actual boat used from the movie. I don't know if it had just gotten its way through the magic of the film studio or it had just worn over time, but obviously it's seen better years. After the fair ended, I know it was down in the Florida Keys. I saw it down there years later in display, and I don't know if it's still down there or not, but for movie buffs, this was a real thrill to see this sitting out in the water. Mark mentioned earlier, and I'll talk more about the financial woes of the fair. These alligators are a good example of it. They're on top of a section of what's called the Wonderwall. We'll talk about that more in a minute. But you can see they just didn't get to finish the alligators. They ran out of money. And then they try to explain it as if this was a conscious styling decision, on the part of the designer. No, it was unfortunate. They just ran out of money for the skin on them. Amphitheater. Again, remember our tremendous stairway to heaven before? Well, this is what they actually ended up building. Very popular water show. Most pictures you see with the audience is just packed with people, but there was no giant stairway. Instead, you went up these towers, and you can see on the right and left side, two people in the midst of their plummeting down. So they both had a comedy aspect to it. They had synchronized swim. They had the high divers. It was a very popular show. Now we go into the Great Hall, which is really the whole reason this place was built in the first place as a convention center. You can see while the fair is open, it's already got the name on it for the New Orleans Convention Center. Down below, you could sail some remote control boats here. Monorail is interesting. It would actually go in and out of the building. And inside, it was pretty much the same as any convention center that we've seen before. Somebody's mentioned the African Queens in Key Largo. I knew I saw it in one of the keys. Thanks. So the monorail is going through here, and you can see down below it's pretty much giant empty space, for the builders to do what they want. This water trough system down below, again, is they had moving cables that pull different barges and different boats around to give it some sense of momentum. But there were a lot of displays in here. The Louisiana State display was in here. The state of Mississippi had its display. There were a number of them that would come in there. You also had some commercial displays. There was one from a giant healthcare system, talked about heart health. Lipton Tea was here. That truck is supposedly the actual truck driven by Sir Lipton when he founded his tea enterprise. You also had some pretty tacky displays. So you could get down below, and here you could get, you can see there's somebody selling mattresses, magical therapy, mattresses, vibrating chairs. There were also shops in here that sold guns, fishing gear. It's easy to look at this and say, oh, that's pretty tacky. Well, every fair, again, ends up having that. The whole thing at the 64 fair, there were several buildings that were just full of tacky stuff like that. You go to the LA County Fair today, there's several buildings of stuff like this. So it's all part of the show experience. You'd love to go and have lots of Futurama 2 rides, but in reality, you have to sell space to anybody that's got the money and the interest to come out. The International Waterfront, a little more interesting, actually a lot more interesting. They had some great exhibits there. Space fans will see, of course, the USS Enterprise smack there in the middle. They did never get a sailing ship in that I know of, but other ships would come in. The Coast Guard ship was here on display. You could come down and see what it did. The white boat up at the top end of the picture was a major barge that was used for dredging ports and waterways throughout the area. People could come on board. You can see the paddle boat is coming up to it. The Canadian Pavilion, if you keep an eye on that, where you see the Canadian flag, remember the shape of that building, because we'll see it a little bit later. Very popular thing on tourism in Canada. And what they did for most of the international pavilions was they gave them a spot within this building that they were pretty much, you're getting X amount of square feet. You can design the outside, put whatever inside you want. So the different nations came up with things to try to draw your eyes to it. And it was a very attractive area because there was a lot of different things going on. So Liberia had, thatch roof hut or a replica, simile of one. Korea, this was a Korean fighting boat from years ago, Korean restaurant up top. So this was very popular. You even had, see off to the left, UNICEF had a display there. Awful lot of the international exhibits are there, and the restaurants in these things were very, very popular. Again, done on the cheap. This looks like a ski resort lift system. That's because it was a ski resort lift system, but it got the new name of Sky Transpo, and it ran along the waterfront, and you could take a thrilling, exciting ride from one end to the other. Then at the end, you had the amphitheater. Again, very, very popular. Lots of very successful shows that were done in there. China Pavilion was the largest of the international pavilions behind it, but it was a real disappointment. When you first go in, there were all these glass cases full of these amazing looking artifacts, things that looked to be very interesting and all. And it turned out to be everything was for sale. We were not looking at real historic artifacts. We were looking at things that were for sale. I think they had a couple bricks from the Great Wall, and some things were historic, but for the most part, China was hi, welcome to our gift shop. What can we sell you? And it was disappointing in that regard. The real key to the area was the Orbiter Enterprise. The 1982 World's Fair for New Orleans had tried to get it brought there, and NASA decided the logistics of getting it there were too daunting. But they really made a push to get it there for display for New Orleans. And it took them quite a bit. They had to fly it on the Orbiter down to a nearby Air Force base, take it off the 747, put it in a barge, take it down the river, take it off the barge, bring it up here onto the display, and it was a very popular exhibit. Just off to the right, not visible in this picture, was an interior NASA display area too. So besides just seeing a static orbiter sitting out there, the interior displays talked about the scientific missions that the space shuttle was built for, talked about satellite programs. It was a very popular exhibit for folks. The U.S. Pavilion, the United States, put a significant effort into the New Orleans World's Fair. Very striking building. Inside, again, the exhibit theme was mostly built around water. So we have lots of water molecules, different displays in there. I got a kick out of this. If you look at it, it's the electronic aquarium, and we're looking at the display of northern pike. Well, it was a lot cheaper to have a video screen showing northern pike to be going around than actually to have aquariums with real northern pikes in them. So there were different computer games. Again, you look at the graphics of these things today, we're so in awe of 1080p graphics and 3D and everything immersive. This is strictly all text. Matter of fact, so much text, it's really hard to read it. It's all crammed in there. But you could go through the pavilion, the different games where you would judge, if I did this, what would happen to water? If I did this, how much water does this activity take? How much water do you use in a year? So it was some very scientific and well thought out designs or displays on the issues of water out there. Then we get to the Wonderwall. And it's interesting. The Wonderwall started out as a solution to an architectural problem. I mentioned before, you had this giant power line that ran right through the center of this thing. No way to get rid of it. They're not going to take it down. So what do you do to masquerade it? We talked at the Disney talk about how they put up the Tower of the Four Winds to draw your eye away from the ugly building that Small World was in. And that's what they ended up doing here for Wonderwall. I keep saying Wonderworld because it was a show by that name at the 64 fair. So here's a section of Wonderwall. Very different designs, all sorts of different crazy shapes and pieces and, you know, colors and designs and everything. And I'll bet it worked. I bet for the most part, as you folks looked at this picture, you weren't really looking at the warehouse behind it. You may be looking at the big parking structure because of the coloration of it. But right behind on the left-hand side, there's a big industrial warehouse, not part of the fair, covered over by the Wonderwall. And the Wonderwall was actually interesting because in some parts it was very narrow. It was just a little facade. Other parts it was deep enough to have a nacho restaurant in it. It actually had a radio station that broadcast throughout the time of the fair. Had a lot of shops. It had all sorts of stuff. And if you look up above, it was just lots of whimsy. You can see some flags, some cherubs up there. There were all sorts of stern figures and happy figures and urns and statues. It was really, the critics, critics just loved the Wonderwall wall because it was just so unique. And every piece of it, you look at this and 5 feet away, the Wonderwall was a totally different structural design. So it was very, very well received. But then we've taken a tour of the fair, and we'll get to the after the fair part. And this is the fellow, name is Peter Spurney. He was the head of the World's Fair. And when I went to write my book, I had to track him down. And one of the first questions he asked me was whether or not I was there to try to sue him. Kenneth, you have your hand up? You have a question? Just unmute yourself with a space bar.
No, sorry, not sure how I generated the hand. I'll get rid of it.
Okay. As long as you're not giving me the finger, you can give me the hand. Okay. But,
no, not yet.
Okay, great. Well, Mr. Spurney was a delight to talk to. You know, the fair ran into a lot of trouble. It has the dubious distinction of being the only World's Fair to actually go bankrupt during the time that the fair was open. So many of them have gone bankrupt after, or they've made a profit of $56, something like that. But they went bankrupt, and they had to get bailout help to keep from the paychecks literally were going to bounce for the fair. And I asked him again. He had been sued, I think he said 21 times in court, and he prevailed in every one of them. But the fair turned out to be a financial disaster, did not make money. And I asked him what happened, and you know, what were his thoughts on it. And a couple of interesting thoughts I'd like to share. One was that they got far less out-of-state visitors than they anticipated by a huge percentage. And we talked about it. You know, was it due to the 1982 World's Fair so recently and relatively close in Tennessee? Was it due to the New Orleans weather? You know, what was it? Well, they came up with their numbers based on the official state tourism numbers that every year the state would publish how many people came to visit the state of Louisiana. And they based on that, how many of those people come to New Orleans, how many people will come and stay in that. And it turned out those numbers were incredibly inflated. They did an audit of them later on. And they found out what was happening is if you drove into Tennessee and you came into, I'll make up a fictional town, Cotter, Louisiana. You pulled into Cotterville and there would be a tourism booth, and you'd go in and get a Louisiana maps and Louisiana tour guides and everything, and you'd go on your way. Well, the people in Cotterville that gave out these maps got reimbursed by the state. So the state gave them the brochures and everything for free. And then they also gave them something like a penny to give out the small brochures or 10 cents to give out the big brochures. So what they found when they did this audit trying to post-mortem the World's Fair was that a lot of these people had just been ordering as many of these booklets as you could get and then just throwing them away and telling the state, oh yeah, I had 50,000 people come through, send me $5,000. Well, this year I got $5,000. Next year I might as well get $7,000. So they found that they had been printing massive amounts of tourist information given out to these agencies all around the borders of Louisiana that were just chucked away. Because when they started looking into it, how many of these alleged visitors ever stayed in a hotel, ever ate at a restaurant, ever actually bought gas? Well, it turned out they got to Cotterville and just vanished off the face of the earth because they never existed. So they had the problem now that they had built the fair on a budget anticipating X amount of people. And they came up with like maybe 1/5 or something of what they thought they were going to get for actual visitors into the area. So they had also started seeing before the fair actually opened that they weren't selling anywhere the number of advance tickets as they thought. They had predicted X amount of sales by the Y point and date and time, and they weren't getting there. And the fellow in the next picture here, he's the mayor of New Orleans at the time, Dutch Morial. He went from a fan of the fair, like most politicians, he swung on a dime and he became an avid, fierce foe of the fair. Because as soon as it became apparent that the fair wasn't going to bring in the numbers that it was supposed to bring in because they weren't selling the tickets they were supposed to be, he started lambasting the fair every chance he got. He became an absolute foe of it. And a lot of the local New Orleans newspapers started picking that up too. And pretty soon, bashing the fair became a very popular sport indeed. And when I was talking to Peter, he gave me a couple interesting thoughts about it. One of the things was that they had sold the season pass, and they had thought that people were going to use the season pass 5, maybe 10 times. And it turned out most people's season passes are going 30 to 40 times. So it was showing that people actually were enjoying the fair, which I said to him, "You must have made you happy that people were enjoying it." He goes, "No, I wasn't happy at all. They were coming so often." And I said, "Why not?" He goes, "Well, they were coming for free. I charged them once, but every time they came to the fair, I had to put toilet paper in the bathrooms and I had to pay when they flushed." So it's interesting perspective. You think about, these great crowds and the place is packed at night, but people are using their annual passes. They had underpriced the annual pass, the season pass, and they had oversold them. So now they were getting huge crowds coming in, but people weren't buying T-shirts. Well, every time somebody bought a T-shirt, the Fair Corporation got a percentage of the T-shirt sales, but now they weren't buying them, so they didn't get it. So their financial woes just kept mounting as time went on. They had made some very poor decisions. And Peter had worked on other fairs, so he was not a novice to it. But he, as he said, he was a novice to New Orleans political climate. And he has since continued to work in the field, done a lot of shows, the Spy Museum in Washington, D.C., other things. But I've asked him if he's ever gone back to New Orleans, and I think it's safe to say he never will. So they ended up, the fair went bankrupt. And as a result, everybody involved sued everybody else. So anybody that had a physical asset of any value, like the rides, people seized them for back paychecks, for contractors that weren't paid. And they got into the issue, okay, if somebody had not been paid for building something on one part of the fair, they would seize anything on any other part of the fair just in the hope that somebody would pay them something to drop their lawsuit and go away. So even though Arrow, as far as I know, paid off its contractors and everything, they still had physical property that was in possession of the Fair Corporation. So people seized every asset they possibly could. Fair got torn down, and a lot of this stuff got stored in warehouses forever. Even things like the United States Pavilion was bought by somebody that was going to build it in another town. It got seized, and I don't think it ever was rebuilt. I think by the time he finally got the title back to it, the project had moved on, and there were quite a few buildings that were announced as being bought and being reconstructed. And 10 years later, nobody, by that time, it was cheaper to just build a new building and not pay the storage fees on the stuff. So the fair had its real set of political issues and everything, but again, enormously successful with people. If you were not happy with the fair, even if you had bought your season pass, you would not be going back 40 times. They had some people that figured they were there every day of the fair. It was very popular with the local crowd. So different pieces of the fair ended up being spread around the city. This was a head, it's called the Source. At the fair, it was in the water garden, had all sorts of fountains going on it. It was relocated to Elk Place and Canal Street, looking a little sad there. The Federal Fiber Mills building, as I mentioned, was a protected building, so they knew it was going to be there. If we remember before the monorail went through it, well, this was the actual apartment that the monorail went smack dab through. I ended up snagging this picture off a real estate listing where somebody was proclaiming that it was probably the only World's Fair pavilion that, or only apartment building for sale anywhere in the world that used to have a monorail run through the middle of it. I got a kick out of that. The monorail itself went down to the Dade Miami Zoo. It's been a little repainted here for an exhibit. The International Waterfront, I mentioned before, remember the Canada Pavilion? That's at the bottom left-hand side here, the multi-story level, kind of a teal covered piece on it. That was the Canadian Pavilion. All down the length of this was the International Waterfront. Now it's become a major tour ship cruise terminal. If you look above the cruise ship, there's a parking lot. That's where Centennial Plaza used to be. You can see the picture of the whales on the side of the building. And for years, if you look down from overhead, you could see the ghostly outline of Centennial Plaza in the parking lot. This has since been repaved a few years over, and now it's just an amazing, a massive amount of blacktop. But I just got a kick for years. I don't think any city has been more successful in eradicating every trace of their World's Fair than New Orleans did. But I got a kick out of the fact that when you went into this parking lot and you went into the shops and all that, you had the whale picture behind you, but you were parking on top of the remnants of the World's Fair. You can see some of the bridges that went across the fair, the railroad tracks from the fair days. The fair site ended up with some notoriety in 1994 when a ship coming into dock had its engine fail, crashed into one of the buildings, had some notes here. Yeah, $15 million worth of damage, $15 million, wow, and it injured 66 people. So that was an unfortunate part to the legacy of the World's Fair. It's since been rebuilt. The convention center has been expanded. I think it's about twice the size it was during the fair. And in the post-Katrina days, it became one of the major sites for the victims of Katrina to come and stay while the city was getting itself sorted out. So never intended, of course, during the fair to be used for anything like that. It was put into shape for that. And it did show, though, that what the fair was intended to do, despite its woes, despite going broke, despite ending up in the newspaper and courts forever and ever, it did do what it was supposed to do. It gave New Orleans a convention center. It gave them the business that they wanted, and now it has helped do exactly what was intended, to make New Orleans a year-round destination. That's the end of my look at the Louisiana World Exposition. Again, for the folks that are new to the chat, worldsfairphotos.com is my website. There's an entire virtual tour of the fair on there, videos and some documentation from the fair. If you go to World's Fair Photos/Zoom, the schedules for each of the upcoming talks are on there. So let me stop the share here. Okay. Oh, goodness, we still have some people out there, and we have some questions. Yeah, Richard, the Morial Convention Center is a very long linear walk. I've done it for work. Yeah, it's a long, big building, isn't it? Oh, by the way, let me take everybody off of mute here. Let's see. Everybody's on mute all. Where's the unmute all button? Well, if you need to unmute yourself, just push the space bar or raise your hand, frantically wave, and I'll unmute you. So, okay, Dave, you had something.
My question was, the timing is such for the water fountain, where I believe Mark Fuller, who now runs Uss Enterprises, had left Epcot. He did the Epcot fountains in 1982. So this was just after that. I wonder if he potentially did the water show.
Don't know that. That's something I can look at. I have so much stuff buried away in so many boxes, but yeah, as you know, there's only so many, names in particular industries, and people tend to go with the people that have done it before. So I'll look into that.
And then I did want to share just, Mark was saying that Arrow did the Haunted Mansion for Walt Disney World. And just as a matter of, I was there, Walt Disney, Imagineering did the ride system for the Haunted Mansion at Disneyland. And then, because I worked on, not the ride, but the show part. And then that system in Walt Disney World was done by Disney. It was, as far as I know, the only ride at Walt Disney World, at the opening of Walt Disney World, that was done by the Imagineering. The Small World was built by Arrow. The dark rides were built by Arrow. This is in 1971. And then gradually, the pirate ride at Disneyland, I believe, was built by Arrow, but the pirate ride in Florida was done by Imagineering, as was Space Mountain. So just as for his future reference, and I found his talk fascinating, just how he had to get the whole thing done in 2 weeks, amazing. And having worked on shows and stuff, I get it. You do what you have to do. And I can see him in the dead of night with the sandbags on the boat. So kudos to him.
I think for any of us that have worked on building one of these things, the last minute, oh crap moments, it's, I can remember when we were doing Space Mountain at Disneyland, the original concept there was a scale with, you'd weigh everybody as they got onto the rocket, and every rocket had a coefficient of friction that was assigned to it. so that you could theoretically dynamically dispatch the sleds based on the performance of each load, as opposed to doing it every X number of seconds. So there's actually a scale that you get in, it would weigh you, calculate real quickly how fast to go. Well, it turned out it didn't work because people would, you put sandbags in it, it worked just great. But when you put people in it, they tend to bounce, they tend to move, they tend to do this and everything. So the computer was saying it would weigh whatever, 3,000 pounds, no 2,000, no 60. The computer just couldn't calculate the weight fast enough as the thing goes. But we had all those sandbags we could have sent to Mark,
I could have used them. You're talking about friction on roller coasters. When I worked at Aero, we did a lot of roller coasters there. And a roller coaster is very finely tuned. You design it for a certain friction, and if that friction changes, and it gets a little too high, the roller coaster won't come back into the station. It'll stop at the lowest dip. And every spring, we could almost count on having 2 or 3 parks call up and say, "Hey, our roller coaster won't make it into the station. What's the problem?" And there's a whole list of things would typically be. One of them would be they painted the rails, and the paint was rough enough that it caused enough friction that it wouldn't do it. Or they had the urethane wheels, or the wheels are coated in urethane. They had someone do it other than Aero, and it was a little different coefficient of friction, maybe a little softer. The most common one was the oil seals on the wheels. They had bearings in the wheels, and they used a liquid lubricant, and they had oil seal, just like you'd have on a car. But the regular oil seal would cause too much friction. A regular oil seal would also have like a metal spring around it on the inside to keep it tight on the shaft. But what Aero do is they would buy this one particular brand of oil seal and take the spring out, and that caused the exact amount of friction that was used to design the ride. And typically what we'd find out is a park over the winter would take all the wheels off, replace all the bearings, and their purchasing department would say, "Oh, that was a Chicago Rawhide seal. We'll buy one from company X because it says it's an equivalent." And they'll put it in, and it had a spring, and it caused too much friction, so it wouldn't come in. So there's a whole list of things, and every year it was 2 or 3 parks would call up and say, "Hey, a roller coaster won't come on," or they would overfill the wheels, and there was enough pumping losses because it was pumping too much oil around there. You were supposed to fill it up about halfway. Of course, the mechanic would fill it up all the way. And so we just go through the list of them. What did you do? What did you do? What did you do? What did you do? And eventually get it working. But they're very, very sensitive.
The fun of field versus reality. I mean, design versus reality. Who else has a question?
Well, I noticed in a lot of slides, one thing that really struck me was how light the crowds were. You said it was a very popular fair. Was that only during the nighttime? It seems like in the daytime, every picture, there's just not a lot of people there.
Yeah, it was pretty light during the day, because again, if you've been to New Orleans in summer, you understand why. And again, a lot of concrete, a lot of emptiness. People would tend to go duck into a pavilion, go into an area with shade. You never saw the sort of crowds, the giant things that you would see packed in some other fairs. So the attendance was much lighter than they anticipated, again by a factor of about 5 to 1. But at nighttime is when it really came out. Once the sun started going down, the heat started dying down, the people started showing up in droves. So if you look at the hourly attendance figures during the day, sometimes I've got some pictures you'd swear there was nobody there. It must have been closed that day. And that night, the place was just packed to capacity, mostly because people came in for the shows, because most of the shows were free. So your annual pass, your season pass got you into the things. There were a few that they did some value added, but for the most part, you get this season pass for whatever I don't remember what they sold them for, something like $60 or something like that. It wasn't much at all. You got to go out there and go as often as you wanted. So nighttime, finish work, go down to the water, have a mint julep, listen to the bands, and then get your bag of Fritos and head on home.
Yeah, I will say I was there over Memorial Day weekend in 1984, and it was a very busy weekend over Memorial Day weekend. But I will say, being a guy from New Jersey, I wasn't used to the New Orleans humidity and heat. And yes, I remember waiting in line to go into the oil derrick and dying because it was just boiling hot and there was no place to go, and being stuck there in the sun, and couldn't wait once I got inside. Thank God it was air conditioned.
didn't want to come out again, did you?
No, I didn't.
Well, that was my first reaction when I heard they were building a World's Fair in New Orleans. Is like, and I talked to Peter about it. I said, why on earth did you do it in summer? You know, I mean, he goes, well, the weather in winter can be cold and wet and everything. I said, but it's not summer, you know? I mean, you know, most World's Fairs are done in summer because the kids are out of school. And I said, well, you don't even have stuff for kids there at the World's Fair. And he said, don't go into that. So, I mean, they had decided before he was hired, that's when it was going to be. But, you know, my first thought, even when, you know, you think about Disney, you know, when they say, well, we're going to go to Florida, you go, Florida? You ever been to Florida in summer? You know? So, yeah, it was definitely a unique challenge to convince anybody from up north to go down south. And they also, because again, they started running into money, you know, sometimes the old saying, you got to spend a buck to make a buck. They didn't have much money to advertise. So, you know, there was very little advertising done in the New York market. Most of it was done by bus companies that were trying to get you to take a bus from New York, go down, they put you in some hotels, and they made, you know, their money on getting you down there, whether you had a good time or not. But it just became an issue that the most, if you think about it, like living here in LA, I don't think I ever saw an ad for it. But I also living, you know, you never saw ads for the Spokane World's Fair. You know, people tended to advertise locally and get their audience locally, and they had next to zero advertising budget for the fair by the time it opened. As I said, if you go on my site, I've got 2 videos. They run about 10 minutes or so each, and one of them was done by Hilton Hotels, and it was to try to be shown at other Hilton properties around the world to try to convince you to come down and stay at the brand new Hilton, which is built right next to the World's Fair site. So lots of enthusiasm, lots of trying to get people down there, but just not a lot of money to, you know, to spread the word.
Yeah. I will say that I flew Braniff, and I had a flight. I had to go.
So did I lose you, or did I heard you said you flew Braniff and you had a flight?
New Orleans and do the same route going back.
Oh, okay.
So,
well, I'm glad you survived.
yeah. Well, I will say the ride back was pretty horrendous. I landed in New Orleans, in Newark, in the middle of a really bad thunderstorm, and we had to turn around. We were 2 minutes from landing in Newark, and had to turn around and go back to Philadelphia because they couldn't land. The plane was going up and down like an elevator. That's how bad the storm was.
Hey, better.
My poor wife was nervous because the airport said that the flight had arrived, and we didn't. And we weren't there. We were in Philadelphia.
Well, Carol and I had a flight one time where we flew from New York to Philadelphia, and it was a small plane, and the up and down part. And Carol's a pretty seasoned traveler. I can see her nodding there. She's been all over the world. We landed on that flight, and she turned to me and said, I don't care how we go back to New York. If you have to buy a car to get us there, I'm not getting back on this plane. It was a small commuter plane. It was a hell of a ride. Oh, yeah. Luckily, there was a bigger plane going back, but she told me, you have to buy a car. That's it. I'm done.
There were several people on our flight who would not get back on the airplane in Philadelphia to go back to Newark. They were just said, no, we're not doing it. We'll rent a car and we'll drive there. That's how bad that flight was that day.
Well, it sounds like most of my landings when I fly. So, anybody else? Any thoughts, memories? David.
Just one question. I was just struck in the photos as compared to the last couple of talks with how the asphalt makes everything look so almost carny cheap. And yet, if you look at the ones from the Montreal fair, there's concrete or painted. Of course, the greenery helps, but it just looks, this fair looks just so stark. And I'm wondering what you can tell me about that.
Again, it came down to money. You know, I talked to them about that. You know, if you go to, again, harping back to the Disney parks, how you have the asphalt colored, you know, it kind of gives it a theming in that. And also you try to come up with a mixture of it that kind of absorbs some of the heat and not just reflect it. You know, Peter was saying they're lucky they were able to pave some parts of it at all. It got down to just purely budget. They had, if you look at the plans, they had all sorts of things in there for planters. He said, okay, I had the money. I could have potentially put some planters in there. I had no money to run water out to the planters to keep the plants alive. So it really got down to, as the fair got done, and certain parts were done earlier, like the Festival Plaza was done earlier. That ended up with more greenage and, color. They had if you look at the ground there, it was done with some tile work and some squares of color, even if it was just black and white or blue and white, whatever it was. But it was something to look at. Well, that was done earlier when the money was there. As they got to the later parts of the fair, they were trying to figure out how they, could get any parts of it paved. I see a note here. Did you miss a part about Huss? Yeah, again, that was where everything got seized in the financial thing. Everything that was physically standing on the premises was seized by anybody, whether they had a legitimate claim to it or not. So if you had a frozen daiquiri stand, somebody was likely to put a claim onto it. Again, you can file a claim, you can do anything you want, whether it's valid or not, and then you try to get somebody to give you 6 cents on the dollar to drop your claim. And that's what the ride systems were caught up in, that there were people that just wanted to get money out of a stone. There was no money to get out of the Fair Corporation. But if you seize the Huss rides by saying that they were part of the obligations of the fair, that the fair paid the Huss people instead of paying you, you can go and try to claw back the money from the Huss people by saying that their payment was made disproportionately and you should have gotten yours. So people just got themselves tied up 9 ways to Sunday in lawsuits, none of which, again, the 21 of them were filed that named Pater himself as an individual. He successfully won all 21 of them. And he said, people were upset. They were rightfully upset that a lot of people lost a lot of money. But he said he wasn't so happy how he came out of it either. He spent the next 15, 20 years defending himself in lawsuits. But the whole fair was based on an incorrect premise that the state of Louisiana had perpetuated on itself by the numbers that they provided. Chris, you had your hand up?
Yeah, a quick comment and then a question. I was working with Mark Fuller in '83 when they actually, I just looked it up. They started wet in '83. The fair was in '84. I don't remember them working on that. The Wikipedia thing says their first major project was '86 in Dallas. So I actually sent him a note to see, but my recollection was he actually started wet in '83, but he wasn't really gone for Imagineering till more like almost '84. So it's not likely that they put any time into it or that they worked on it.
Oh, great. Thanks for doing the research for us.
Sure. Yeah. I was curious myself because I watched them start that company. The question was, how far were they off financially? Meaning, the big picture, do you know, like, okay, asphalt, did they really cheap out compared to ones that succeeded? Did they not meet that threshold? And secondly, clearly they made their business model wrong because they were so far off on the tourism from other states. If that tourism had showed up, would they have been successful?
Yeah, if the tourism had shown up, they would have been successful because they did cut the budget back as they saw they were having the problem. They actually came fairly close, to making it to the end without declaring bankruptcy. It's not like they went bankrupt the first month. I have the date again. There was down near the end of it, and it would have been an embarrassment to close a month early or whatever. So they were in trouble, but not enough trouble that they had to close the first week, the first month, halfway, anything like that. So, but they were smart because again, they realized they were going to have a problem and that it was not going to make money. So their initial budget, they started whacking it all the way back. And when I was talking to Peter about it, he said it wasn't so much just being smart. It's sometimes they just had a tremendous cash flow problem because the advanced ticket sales were supposed to fund things like trees and planters and that sort of thing. And the advanced ticket sales were just not happening. So he said that they were hoping then that if the fair opened and people were coming, that they were really planning, again, on some of these things like planters and trees. You can always plop them down in the middle of the night, just like you can move sandbags in the middle of the night. Yeah. So they were really hoping that they could try to fix some of the flaws of the fair if people started coming, and that they could then, do a guerrilla thing, middle of the night, come and paint the asphalt or come and put 6 trees down or something. but he said they just weren't coming. The numbers again were way down. And again, they ended up with a small fraction of the people that they were expecting to come. And it's again, that's the conflicting numbers. A lot of people did come, but they were the annual pass holders coming over and over and over. So their number of individual ticket sales were, something like 20% of what they had initially anticipated. They were way down, and that created an ongoing series of problems for him throughout the period of time.
Yeah.
Darlene, you have your hand up?
I do. I wonder, since you've got 1984 Olympic, you've got the World's Fair in May, and then you've got July, you've got Los Angeles Summer Olympics, all within the same year. So you've probably got a lot of the international people that were saving to go to one or the other. I mean, the Olympics, Los Angeles, that was a huge deal.
Yeah. Again, I asked him about that, and how did you pick that year? And he said very carefully, I did not pick that year. They picked it to be 100 years after the other World's Fair because they thought that would be a great marketing ploy. Whoever picked that year, and he was again emphatic, it was not me. Somebody in New Orleans before him, before he was hired, because again, he was not a New Orleans guy, and that was why he didn't get on with the mayor. He was a exposition guy. He had done others and everything. He was brought in to run somebody else's design. But the city of New Orleans picked 1984, and you knew the Olympics was coming. And he said they didn't think it would be a big issue, and he never knew how much of an issue it was. But yeah, he said 1984 was, worst case scenario to try to go against something like the Olympics. The other thing was that Epcot was still fairly new at that point in time. So a lot of people that were heading down south, they were probably going to go to Epcot and go over to see Disney World, the so-called permanent World's Fair, which had so much more to offer than his fair did.
Mm-hmm. All interesting.
Yeah, the perfect storm. Chris?
I got confirmation from Mark that they didn't work on that.
Okay. Either that or he just doesn't want to get sued.
Exactly, yeah. Why have anything to do with that, right?
Yeah. No, it's really unfortunate because what happened with the world, one post note I forgot to mention was that the U.S. government, with the failure of the 84 World's Fair, said, that's it. The United States is not going to participate in any more World's Fairs. We're not going to bail you guys out. So they actually pulled out of the Bureau of International Expositions after this fair and said, we're not going to do anymore. They already made a commitment to Vancouver's Expo 86, so there was a U.S. pavilion there. But after that, that was the end of World's Fairs in the United States. And it's a situation that continues today. There's been talk about putting one in, I think they were trying to do Minnesota a while back. LA talked about doing it. There's been various ones. And the federal government says not going to fund it. Because, and I've mentioned this in other talks, getting all that money built into that pavilion in Louisiana was great for the state of Louisiana, and it was okay for the great or whatever for the city of New Orleans. It didn't do anything for Montana, didn't do anything for New Jersey, didn't do anything for any of the other states. So now you get a federal appropriation and go, hey, I want to build a World's Fair and I want to build it in Cotterville. And then all the other people are going to go around, well, I'm from Crocketville. Why I want to put a World's Fair there? Hey, I'm from Runco City. Why are you going to do that? So it's become so political that the U.S., generally all of our pavilions and other World's Fairs are now sponsored by Coca-Cola, Nike, IBM, Texas Instruments. They're all done by industry as opposed to the government, which has really cheapened our presence at World's Fairs. Because I've gone to some of them and I felt like I was at a trade show as opposed to a national pavilion.
Yeah, we had something in Milan, right? I remember looking at that.
That again was a industrially sponsored pavilion. Yeah, the U.S. government puts its name on it, but just like a lot of the pavilions, the China pavilion at the 84 World's Fair was not sponsored by the government of China. It was Chinese businessmen that came in under the name China, which is why I ended up with basically a giant gift shop. But the U.S., the one that's supposed to be done this year that's been pushed off to next year in Dubai, the U.S. government has put some money into that. They got some money there, but a small pittance of what the overall cost of the project is.
Yeah. I assume you've seen the film, Where's the Fair?
Yeah, I'm actually in it.
Okay, I forgot that. It's been a long time. But that whole discussion about the way that came about and then the short-sightedness. But but we're not even a member. I don't even know if we're a member of the Bureau of International Expositions at this point.
Just rejoined. Yeah, after 30 whatever years. Yeah.
Yeah, it was like $25,000 and we wouldn't spend it.
That's right.
Yeah.
The government actually passed a piece of legislation forbidding the United States to be a member of the BIE and forbidding to pay the dues. And you think, yeah, again, $25,000 a year, just to say in the good graces. And I think they may have made them pay retroactively when they got back into it. So,
If I remember, Secretary of State Hillary Clinton got browbeaten by the Chinese when they were going to have Shanghai, and we were not taking part. And so we did kind of quickly put that project together. So
yeah,
it's
the United States Pavilion, aka the Coca-Cola Pavilion.
Yeah.
Who else? Anybody else? Appreciate it. I see a hand waving. Is that for Timothy? Or are you just covering the camera, or are you waving for a question?
Well, I remembering when you guys were talking about roller coasters, I was on the opening team of Big Thunder Mountain in Florida. And I remember the discussion about the way they had to engineer the ride. Florida has weird weather. And they would pack the wheels of the roller coaster in grease versus oil, depending on the time of the year. And in the wintertime in Florida, when it was cold, and we had some freezing weather way back when, in 1980, 81, when we took a train off, we had to keep it off, because if we brought it back in, it would result in a ride, I think, underrun or overrun. I can't remember the name of the term, but it would cause the ride to go down. So if you took a train off in the wintertime, you kept it off. You just could not bring it back on. So I'm sure that was probably an issue in the New Orleans World Fair.
Well, we had, when we built Big Thunder at Disneyland, the wheel bearings became a big issue there too, because it was the big issue to use magnetic sensors, to use optical sensors, that sort of thing. And the computer was supposed to keep track. And I don't remember how many trains there are actually on the ride, but looking at the computer would do a shutdown and you say, okay, thought there were 121 trains on the track at that point in time, which you couldn't physically park that many. But that's because the sensor would be here at the bottom of a dip, and all the grease was running all the way down, because again, it goes through the water splash and everything, but we also occasionally do get rain out here. So I remember, them trying to figure out how do we fix that, because the computer, it'd start great. You'd run everybody through it, everything going great, and all of a sudden a train would pop up where you're looking at the empty section of track, and the computer's swearing there's a train out there right now. And another train gets into it and the Phantom train isn't moving. That's strange.
Yeah.
So yeah, we went crazy.
Huge issue in Florida during the summer thunderstorms. You get flag outs where the rain would flag the sensors and the ride would go down. So we hated it.
At Arrow, one of the ways that we would commonly tune a new roller coaster was by changing the viscosity of the lubricant in the wheels and changing the volume of the oil in the wheels. Because you put up a new roller coaster and you had to guess about how much wind, how much, how good the track is, all this sort of thing. And so that was one of the tools we had to fine tune. We could change the viscosity of the oil, and if you really need a light one, I think the lightest one we used was automatic transmission fluid we put in there. Was about the slickest stuff we had. If it was a little fast, and you go up on a viscosity, or you might put 3/4 of it full instead of half full. So it was a good mechanism to tune a roller coaster.
Yes.
The fine tuning of rides, I still love when I talked to Bob Gurr and he was talking about the '64 World's Fair and how they had to debug the Ford Pavilion with baseball bats, and I thought, were you bashing all the cars with them? And he said, no, every time they would get to crash, there was a guy standing in the tunnel and he would jam a baseball bat under the wheel to stop the car from hitting it until they figured it all out. So you think about this miracle high-tech ride, everything is going great, and Bob's at the sporting goods store buying every baseball bat he could find in New York to keep the Ford Pavilion going. The high-tech, guys standing with baseball bats. Things.
Well, remember when we opened up Epcot and Spaceship Earth, they literally stationed a guy at the bottom of the drop
Yes.
because the cars wouldn't rotate.
Yeah.
Correct.
So they had to have a maintenance person there to manually turn them around. That would have been
Yes.
a wonderful job to have.
Yeah, I was on the opening crew of Spaceship. I was a lead, and they originally they tried to make it an omnivore system where you rotated to face the different scenes, and the locking mechanism was not good. So they finally took out. I remember one of the Imagineers went through and said, "Yeah, we need to change this." So the only thing that they could work for was to have it change at 180 top and 180 bottom, as they called it, and they had maintenance crews up there to make sure that the vehicles were locked in place.
I've always wanted to ask this. Why, when they turn those cars around at the very top, do I need a voice telling me your car is turning around? Don't worry. I mean, what? Why?
Well, that's a good thing or question. The guests were scared that they all of a sudden lost, if they were in separate cars, all of a sudden they couldn't see their other guests.
Oh, huh.
And it worried them. So, yeah. So it was kind of a warning that, okay, you're not going to see your family for the rest of the ride. So, but you're good. Yeah. The maintenance was up there for quite some time. We actually had a lot of cast members up there at different points to make sure that the cars were proceeding correctly.
Mm-hmm.
And we had ESOPs we would hit if the cars would go off track.
Okay. Well, thank you. I've been curious about that ever since I first wrote it.
Yep.
It didn't scare me that the car was turning. Why are you warning me?
Because there's lawyers in this world.
Correct.
Yeah.
Well, appreciate everybody joining us. I didn't even look at my own schedule. I forget what next week's talk is. Does anybody have it handy in front of them?
No.
I think next week might be Vancouver 86. If not, maybe it will be. I'll have to look at the schedule. It's around the schedule. It will be the schedule for next week. Yeah, Baron, you have a question? You're waving a hand? Just push the space bar to unmute yourself.
There
There
you
you go.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Good. Well, greetings, everyone. Very informative debate, Bill. Thank you very much. Appreciate it. You had noted, someone had noted, perhaps you, that during '84, there was also the time that Epcot was opening up, and that perhaps guests, visitors, were more enthusiastic about coming to Central Florida to go to Epcot than they were wanting to go to New Orleans. I was sort of in that situation. I had gone back to graduate school in '83, and in '84, my fiance and I came back to Florida for the summer, where I'm from. And on our way back, we stopped at Epcot that had just opened, roughly. And part of it was for me to do my research, because my graduate thesis was the construction of a pavilion about weather at Epcot Center. So during my graduate school years, not only was I researching Walt Disney World and Disneyland, but pretty much the World Fairs as well too. And New Orleans was one of them. And I certainly recall how I thought New Orleans was going to be a financial disaster, which it turned out to be. But I happen to be in that same boat where I'm thinking, well, do I want to go to New Orleans because I had the opportunity that summer to attend, or did I not have the chance since it didn't fit in my schedule really while I was back in Florida? But it had crossed my mind that I thought, well, I'd like to go. I'd like to see it. I'd like to experience it. But I think maybe Epcot Center won out only because it's more local to me. And of course, I was at Walt Disney World within the month after they had first opened back in 74, 73, 72, 75, I can't remember now. But I do recall that the Exxon Pavilion at Epcot Center. And
University of
someone
Energy.
was speaking of having to manually turn the cars around or something because they weren't operating correctly. That I believe the Exxon Pavilion wasn't even open yet. So I knew, okay, everything was relatively brand new at the time, but I needed to get in there and see things. But I just thought I'd add that little story to the chat here today. Thank you.
Well, the Universe of Energy was a real fascinating pavilion.
Yes.
You know, the pre-show, if you remember, had all these moving screens that you were supposed to
Yes.
see different visages come out. I must have seen that pre-show 20 times before I actually got into the theater itself because the thing kept breaking down inside.
Yes.
They had all sorts of problems. So they had poured the concrete floor, and it turned out it needed to be accurate to 0.00001 inches or something, because everything else would get thrown off. And
Yep.
it was interesting because I can remember being at design meetings and talking about different things. And there were, if you guys that were at Epcot remember the first week, there were nothing out there in terms of pylons or stanchions or anything for crowd control, because the pre-show area is just going to be so big, everybody will fit inside. So,
Nope.
you know, that was going to work just great. Well, it turned out it didn't work great if the people were in the pre-show for 2 or 3 showings waiting to go into the thing. So the whole first week of Epcot, drilling holes and taking stanchions and trying to figure out crowd control and everything. But eventually just give up. The screens aren't working, so we'll just leave them in place and lose that part of the show. But when I finally got to go through the Universe of Energy, it was like I just kept waiting. If everybody else has gotten stuck, how come we're not? It was like it came out at the end. It was great fun.
Yes.
But nothing works right the first time, right? I
Correct.
remember this.
Correct.
I remember my first trip on Space Mountain. We had been sending sandbags through it, and I had the job of going over to the in-between, the employee cafeteria later on to get people, because again, when you put dummies through or sandbags, they don't move. Now we wanted to get people. But this first time we had decided, this is really great. It's safe for human life. Let's take out some sandbags. Let's go for a ride. Got up to the first lift, got to the first turn, and the thing did an e-stop, and we're stuck there. And I still remember this day, the guy on the other side was very big and very heavy. And I'm trying to push him and hold him back. And we're realizing the only ones of us that know what to do or anything are sitting here in this rocket. And, what are we going to do? And finally, somebody came into the mountain. Are you guys up there? Yeah. But I forget who the guy was, but he was a big, heavy guy. And it was like, no. Yeah. And he's just as desperate to hold on to the other side of the rock because he's not trying to fall on me. But it seemed like ages. It was probably 5-10 minutes, but it was like, oh yeah, this is a great experience. So after that, make sure there's somebody down below watching what you're doing, because just hitting the dispatch button, jumping into the rocket and going was not a good idea.
Yes, I remember, Bill, when we first opened, I was there on opening day, as I informed you guys. We used to joke that all the lines for the Future World pavilions met at the Communicore fountain.
Yeah.
So if you were at the end of the line, cast member, greeter, you want the land? Okay, that's that line. Oh, you want the energy? Okay, that's this line over here. And it was crazy. It was crazy. And Universe of Energy had a lot of issues because it was a very brand new ride system, very state of the art, but it had a lot of issues. And I can remember the last day that the Universe of Energy was in operation, of course, the last ride, it went 101. It went down. But the guests loved it, and they took pictures of the dinosaurs, and that was it. But and I love that. I love working that pavilion because it was so unique.
Again, thank God what you can do for epoxying floors and trying to smooth them out, huh?
Yes. Yes.
Well, again, thank you all. Any other questions? Or
I was going to say the funny thing is that I have been back to Epcot, and Walt Disney World a few times between the time that I was in graduate school. But when I left graduate school finally in 91, I haven't been back to Walt Disney World since.
Shame on you.
I know. I was going to say y'all can criminalize me, and it's a terrible thing because it's only 3 hours away from here.
My
But I
stock,
could-
my stock depends on you. Turn around and go.
And the crowd's real light right now.
Well,
Yeah, the crowds look just like the '84 World's Fair.
That's true, and I'll tell you what. I'll tell you what's been part of the disillusionment for me the last 30 years is that, like I can see most of us here who are of age that we grew up with the wonderful world of color.
Yes.
Beginning 1985 and on up, the theme-related pavilions, particularly at Epcot Center and some at Walt Disney World, the Magic Kingdom area, weren't of my era. I didn't really grow up with Monsters, Inc., and I didn't grow up with Michael Jackson to that point where they had Michael E.O. or whatever the thing was.
Captain EO.
Yeah, and most of those pavilions, as they are now, they're great for the youth and the kids of this generation and the Gen X, but they just don't do anything for me. So is there an interest to want to go up there and see it? Yeah, sure. I'll go to Main Street and go watch the President's Pavilion and Abraham Lincoln again and things like that. But do I want to go up there and see, whatever's current pavilion is up there now? It's just past my time. And not that I don't like current events and would want to get involved in stuff like that and go see it if I were there, I would.
Yep.
But I think that's been part of the hesitancy of wanting to get in the car and take a weekend and go up there is, okay, I see Michael Jackson on TV. I don't need to go see his pavilion.
Yeah, but for me, I mentioned earlier, I'm not a big fan of things that spin you in circles. So, a lot of the rides like that I would skip. But to me, I still go back and you go on like the Carousel of Progress. Attendance is always very light, but I don't care. I'm taking myself back to when I was 12 years old and I saw it the first time. Go Bond Pirates. Again, it's not a thrill ride. I remember first time my daughter on it going down the waterfall and she was like, I said, oh, this is really great when it makes the loop, and she's terrified trying to figure out how that's going to happen. But yeah, I still go to Disney for the ambiance.
True.
Just to walk down the street, see the people enjoying themselves, and the little attention to details that you don't see in other theme parks, and we've gone through cycles, the Pressler years and the cheaping down of this and that. And, Disney has its good years and bad years, but I still think the Disney experience, and I'm not saying this because I'm hoping to get a job at Disney. I've been there, done that. I still think it's a unique experience, and it's because to me the big part is looking at all the other people that are enjoying themselves and having a good time, and just crowd watching to me is a lot better than standing in line for Space Mountain. For most of us that worked at the parks and everything, don't you guys hate to wait on line for something you built? It's
Correct.
like you go there and you say, I used to get paid to ride this thing. Now I'm going to stand here in this Florida sun for 2 hours to go ride it. No, I'm going to go get an ice cream, do something like that. But it's the ambience I enjoy. And
I enjoy taking nieces, nephews, grandnephews to the park. And I appreciate their enjoyment of something new.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
But there's nothing, I'm sorry, there's nothing like the American Adventure or Hall of Presidents or even the Canadian Circle Vision.
The French film. I still love I don't know how many times I've seen Impressions of France, but I listen to the soundtrack of it in my car. It's just and I go to places in France and go, I've seen that. This is great. So
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah, I was going to say World Showcase still evokes the World's Fair as being better than almost anything else in existence.
Yeah. You're there now. Are the fireworks good tonight?
Yeah, I figured I had to fire back with some beautiful picture from Epcot to encourage it.
By the way, Kenneth,
I went to school in Normandy back in the 80s, late 80s, and that made me appreciate the France film so much more.
Kenneth, I just wanted to tell you, for your backdrop, I just saw listed online this week, they're auctioning off the barges that were used for the fireworks show for illuminations. So,
Oh, wow.
yeah, I don't know how big your pool is in your
Hmm.
backyard or anything.
I'm pretty sure that's against the covenants for the
There you go.
association.
Yeah, I mean, I'm sure somebody, I looked at the online, they're just big barges, and all the mortar stuff's been taken off them and everything, but they're making a big deal about you can own the illumination fireworks barges.
The neighbors just put in a rain garden. Maybe I could just kind of slip the barge in there at night,
Bill, I was wondering, is Disney planning anything special for the 65th anniversary of Disneyland this year?
For Disneyland,
Yeah, it'll be open 65 years in July.
Yeah, I mean, there's the big thing about what they're doing for Disney World and Disneyland. I think all that's pretty much on hold right now because of the coronavirus. They've stopped all the parades. They stopping a lot of the interactions out on the street and everything. So I don't think they have any plans that, if anything's been announced up to now, I think it's all fluid and changed. And I think for everything else, I'm just trying to think of anything I've heard. I mean, we're just trying to figure out when it's going to open. And I know I'm not going to be the first guy through.
I think they said July 11th.
That's for Disney World.
In Florida, yes.
Yeah, Disneyland, we still don't have any target date that I've heard of.
Oh, really? Okay.
Yeah, and I would not be wearing a mask in Florida in July, so you won't see me there anytime soon.
Yeah.
They did just announce that they're not going to remodel Spaceship Earth after all. They're going to just reopen it when the park reopens.
Yes, I think I heard that also.
Budgets because of all the damage is done.
Yep.
Which means I wouldn't be looking for any big celebrations if they're cutting projects like that.
No.
I mean, I don't know. I've never worked for the mouse, but that would seem logical that they probably won't go there.
Hey, I did a costume character in Florida. A mask would be nothing. you go dress up as a chipmunk in Florida in summer. You see what life is like.
Yeah, no doubt.
I know that they're working on gathering the information for those of us who worked on the opening of the park in 1971, who worked on it. There's, of course, there's the Hyperion Historic Alliance that's responsible for kind of custodianship of the history of the company. And they are doing interviews of the people that, we had a reunion for the 35th anniversary of Epcot, and there were interviews, video interviews done with the idea of doing something special for the 50th anniversary of the opening of Walt Disney World, which will be in next year.
Yeah.
Right. Okay.
Well, I was there about 3 weeks after it opened in 1971, and I think probably went up about 4 or 5 times. I was in high school during that time, and again, being only 3 hours away, it was an entertaining place. That was back during the day of A tickets and B tickets and C tickets and cheap admission fares. Nowadays it's rather expensive, and that's not part of my disillusionment of wanting to go back. It's just it's a different time for me. And although what's actually been helpful is there had been for years me wanting to go back to take a look at the grounds, to see what's been new, to see what's been replaced, to also again reassess the area that I used to develop the pavilion that I had designed for my master's thesis, which actually earned me my master's degree, and to see how again it would fit within that context of what was there afterward. But now with the advent of Google Maps and Google Earth, I can just zoom right in and take a look all the way around.
Well, one thing I get frustrated with people out here all the time complaining about how much Disneyland costs, and that, Walt would be so upset on what it costs today, and, it ought to be basically free for everybody so they can take their kids. And yet these same people, Disneyland's something like $135 a day or something now. And these same people think nothing about spending $200, $300 for a Lakers game.
Correct.
You stop and think about what the cost of a Broadway show is. And it lasts for whatever, 3 hours or something, a Dodger game, anything like that. And yeah, it is expensive if you take, a family of 4 to Disney World. You're into $500. By the end of the day, you're done at $800 with food and everything else like that. But you also can get there at 8 in the morning, leave at 2 in the morning, if you choose to be a total masochist. And there's the very, very, if you really want to go dirt cheap, you can bring a bag lunch. You can, you don't have to buy a t-shirt or anything. It is expensive to get in. But when you compare the price per hour to just about any other event that's out there,
Yes.
there's just no comparison. And yeah, it's $135. But these people that, they want to go to me, one of the things Disney needs to do is get rid of the damn annual passes, because people buy them and they spend $1,000, and now I have to get my money's worth. So I'm going to go, just like the New Orleans World's Fair. I'm going to go every night. I'm going to go every weekend. I'm going to do everything to get my $1,000 back. And for the people that come from out of town, coming from, I don't know, Arizona or something, the experience is, sardines. I mean, I can go to the park for free, and I hardly ever go. The last time Carol and I went was to go down and speak to the Disneyland Retirees Club. We went in by about 6 o'clock. We said, time to go home, and so it's just, to me, they're too crowded. That's my big gripe. But I still, and I'm not, there's enough things about Disney, I could go crazy about hating or annoyed or dislike things that have changed. But I think that the price that they charge to get in, for the number of hours that you get, compared to a Lakers game, wow. It's the people like I said, we have people out here all the time. I moderate some Facebook groups about Disneyland and Disney World, and people come on ranting and raving about the ticket prices.
Yep.
Yet they're wearing a $150 pair of shoes as well, too. So
yeah, exactly.
There you go. There you go.
Yeah.
Well,
and
again,
it's not even as bad. I mean, if you go for 5 days, the cost per day drops way down.
Yeah. Yep.
Well, I value my lifetime silver pass, because I worked there for well over 20 years, and I that's great. But I do think that there is, as Bill said, some value for people to go there compared to other venues.
Yeah, just even compared to the other theme parks around, Universal's not cheap these days, and
It's more expensive, actually.
It's more? Oh.
I find when my wife and I split, when we go to Florida, we go to both, and we find our days at Universal cost us more than our days at House.
Are you buying more souvenirs?
No, it's just that I can't spend 5 days at Universal. I run out of things to do, and therefore I don't get that multi-day advantage. And their hotels are way up there. There aren't any good and expensive ones.
All right.
Yeah.
I'm just looking. Next week is Expo 86. I thought so. And anybody here go to Expo 86?
No.
Mark will be chatting.
Yeah,
Expo
I actually didn't go to it, but I did have a hand in one of the rides I could talk a little bit about.
Okay.
Too.
Expo 86 was a total kind of opposite of the 84 World's Fair. Super well received, very popular with the guests, financially successful, tremendous use of the water that it was put on. I mean, there was not a lot Expo 84 or 84 World's Fair could do with the Mississippi River, but putting things along the water at Expo 86, it was just a real delight of a fair. Last one held in North America, but super, super popular and successful fair. So we'll be talking about that next week. And then the week after that is Spokane, Expo 74, one of the smallest World's Fairs ever held in a city that they said could never, ever possibly hold a World's Fair and be successful. Again, amazingly successful, met all of its admission goals, met its financial budgets, turned a profit, and has left a wonderful city park back there that Carol and I were at 3 years ago. That is just a gem of a place to go. So appreciate your folks joining today, and hope we'll see a bunch of you next time. Again,
yes.
Website, there's videos. I encourage you to go look at the site preparation video about the Expo, or I keep saying Expo 84, the 84 World's Fair, the Hilton's hotels, promo and other stuff like that. I think you might get another appreciation for how much dirt and stuff they had to move to. Again, the 84 fair had its problems, but for what the guys did with what they were given to do, I mean, to me, hats off. I give them, 2 thumbs up. It had its issues, but the people from New Orleans loved it. It was a great fair, and it's easy to point out all the things people do wrong, but these people did an awful lot right, and it was a great time. So thanks all for coming.
Thanks, Bill.
Thank you, Bill. Outstanding.
Awesome. As
Take
always.
care.